The lighthouse on Rook Island had always been an eerie sight, a grim sentinel standing against the eternal fury of the ocean. Its whitewashed stone walls, now scarred by time and weather, bore a sinister air, like the crumbling facade of a ghost's lair. For over 20 years, it had stood abandoned, a silent witness to the mysteries it guarded. The last keeper, a man named Thomas Morrow, had vanished without a trace on a storm-ravaged night, leaving behind questions that would never be answered. The fishing village across the bay had its share of stories. Some swore they had seen the lighthouse's beams slicing through the foggy nights long after its mechanisms were dismantled. Others claimed to see figures pacing in the tower's windows, shadowy forms that couldn't belong to anyone alive. But the most chilling accounts were of the voices. Fishermen returning late from sea told of whispers carried on the wind, indistinct but persistent, and too human to be anything natural. They called it the Whispering Light, and spoke of it only in hushed tones. Lena's family had always been in the business of restoring old structures, a tradition spanning 3 generations. Each project had its own stories, its own scars, and this lighthouse was no different. Hired to revive the crumbling structure on Rook Island, they approached the task as just another challenge, demanding perhaps, but well within their expertise, or so they thought. The island greeted them with an almost tangible hostility. As their car wound along the fog-choked road toward the lighthouse, the family was enveloped by a sense of foreboding. The cliffs loomed on one side, jagged and treacherous, while the ocean's relentless roar filled the air with an unyielding presence. The headlights pierced the mist, revealing little more than fleeting glimpses of the untamed landscape. Sam gripped the steering wheel tightly, his usual jokes replaced with an uncharacteristic silence. In the back seat, Will and Emma exchanged uneasy glances. Will, the elder of the two, fiddled with his camera, muttering about how the place looked like it belonged in a horror film. Emma, usually dismissive of his dramatic flair, merely nodded, her gaze fixed out the window where shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Lena sat in the passenger seat, poring over blueprints of the lighthouse. "It's just another building," she said aloud, more to reassure herself than anyone else. "We've tackled worse." But as they pulled up to the keeper's cottage, a small, weathered building near the shore, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to deepen. The cottage itself seemed to huddle against the encroaching wilderness, its faded paint and warped shingles bearing the weight of countless storms. It creaked as if sighing with relief at their arrival. Or was it a warning? The family unloaded their belongings in silence, the usual chatter conspicuously absent. Inside, the cottage smelled of mildew and age, its walls adorned with faint outlines where pictures had once hung. The air was damp, and the windows rattled even though the wind had stilled. Lena tried to brush off the unease as exhaustion from the journey, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, waiting. The house they were staying in, an old keeper's cottage near the shore, creaked and groaned under the relentless weight of the sea breeze. The structure had been hastily cleaned by the real estate company, but they couldn't scrub away the years of solitude embedded in its bones. The musty scent of damp wood and age lingered in every corner, clinging to the faded wallpaper and worn floorboards. The walls bore the faint, ghostly outlines where pictures had once hung, suggesting a life that had been wiped away, leaving only faint echoes of its presence. The windows, though firmly shut, rattled slightly as if they were unsettled by unseen hands. The small fireplace in the corner gave a modest warmth, but it didn't quite banish the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The furniture, though functional, felt misplaced, as if it had been set there by someone who didn't truly belong. A threadbare rug in the living room barely muffled the sound of their footsteps, which seemed unnaturally loud against the uneasy silence. At first glance, the cottage seemed adequate, a safe haven after a long journey. It had running water, working electricity, and enough space for the family to settle in while they worked on the lighthouse. Yet there was something indefinably wrong about the place. The air inside felt heavier than it should, pressing down on their chests with an almost suffocating density. The salty tang of the ocean air seeped through the cracks, mingling with the scent of mildew, creating a cloying, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to their skin. The sea outside was no better. Its ceaseless waves crashed against the jagged rocks with a rhythm that felt less like nature's randomness and more like a deliberate pulse, an unholy heartbeat that resonated in their bones. Even when the wind died down, the roar of the ocean persisted, as though the island itself was alive and displeased with their presence. At night, the cottage took on an even darker personality. The creaks and groans of its wooden frame became louder, almost purposeful, as though it was shifting uncomfortably under their intrusion. The shadows cast by the dim lights seemed to move on their own, stretching and recoiling as if alive. The windows continued their restless rattling, and occasionally, a faint scratching sound came from the walls, too soft to pinpoint, but too persistent to ignore. It was warm enough inside, but no amount of heat could chase away the cold dread that seeped into their hearts. Even the family dog, a usually cheerful retriever named Max, refused to enter certain rooms, growling low in his throat whenever he approached the hallway leading to the bedrooms. He would sit by the fireplace instead, his ears perked and his eyes fixed on something none of them could see. More than once, Lena caught herself glancing over her shoulder, convinced she'd seen movement just at the edge of her vision. But each time she turned, there was nothing. Despite its unsettling atmosphere, the cottage provided what they needed: a roof, shelter, and proximity to the lighthouse. Lena tried to focus on that. Yet, as the first night stretched on, the oppressive air seemed to grow heavier, and the relentless crash of the waves outside morphed into a rhythm that sounded almost like whispered words. Words she couldn't quite understand, but that filled her with an inexplicable sense of dread. On the first night, after a long day of assessing the damage to the lighthouse, Lena stood on the beach and looked out over the water, her gaze fixed on the tall, solitary structure. The light at the top flickered, though it hadn't been turned on in years. She frowned and rubbed her eyes. The light had always been broken, but tonight it pulsed faintly, as if someone were standing there, watching. "Mom?" Will's voice came from behind her. "You okay?" Lena turned. Will and Emma stood just at the edge of the sand, their faces pale and uneasy. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. "Just looking at the lighthouse. Something about it feels off, doesn't it?" Sam joined them, his thick work boots sinking slightly into the wet sand. "I'll head over there tomorrow and take a look at the wiring. It's probably just faulty equipment." But the next day, strange things began to happen. They hadn't even started work when the lighthouse door swung open on its own, creaking loudly as if protesting the disturbance. The sound echoed ominously, as though the structure itself resented their presence. Sam, ever the skeptic, brushed it off as the wind, though the air outside had been eerily still moments before. "It's just the old wood settling," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. As they stepped inside, a cold draft enveloped them, carrying with it a damp, metallic scent that seemed to stick in their throats. The spiraling staircase loomed ahead, winding upward into darkness, its steps worn and uneven. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the tower, though there was no sign of a leak. Lena hesitated at the base of the stairs, her stomach tightening with an inexplicable dread. "Let's just get this over with," Sam said, starting up the stairs, his boots clanging loudly against the metal steps. Will followed, his camera slung over his shoulder, while Emma clutched her flashlight, its beam trembling slightly as she moved. Lena brought up the rear, her every instinct screaming at her to turn back. Halfway up, the air grew heavier, thicker, as though they were wading through an invisible fog. The walls, once whitewashed, were now streaked with grime and peeling paint, revealing dark, mottled stone beneath. Faint scratches marked the surface, some shallow, others deep enough to catch the light. The smell grew stronger, the sharp tang of rust and decay mingling with something subtler but more disturbing. Something that reminded Lena of blood. Emma's flashlight began to flicker erratically. "What's wrong with this thing?" she muttered, shaking it in frustration. The light stabilized for a moment, only to dim again as they ascended higher. "Wait," Emma whispered, stopping suddenly. She pointed her flashlight toward the wall. The beam illuminated a dark stain that stretched unevenly across the surface, its edges blurred as though it had seeped deep into the stone. "What is that?" Will asked, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, they noticed something else, a series of faint carvings etched into the stone just above the stain. The words were jagged, as if scratched hurriedly by trembling hands. Lena stepped closer, squinting to make out the message. "Leave, before it sees you." The word sent a chill down her spine. "Who?" Who would have done this? She stammered, her voice trembling. Probably just some kids messing around, Sam said, though his tone betrayed his unease. Come on, let's keep moving. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the message was a warning, a desperate plea from someone who had been here before. As they climbed higher, the sense of wrongness only deepened. The air grew colder, the metallic scent sharper, and the shadows along the walls seemed to shift and writhe like living things. At the top of the tower, the source of the unease revealed itself. The lantern room, long out of service, was filled with an unnatural glow. The light, impossibly bright, cast stark, elongated shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. The machinery, rusted and broken, should have been incapable of functioning, yet the beam cut through the fog outside with a precision that defied explanation. Will raised his camera, his hands trembling as he began to record. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered. The whispering began then, a low, indistinct murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as though dozens of voices were speaking at once, their words overlapping in a chaotic, unintelligible chorus. Lena turned in circles, trying to locate the source. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Emma replied, her face pale. It's coming from the walls." Sam stepped forward, his phone in hand, recording the room as if trying to rationalize what was happening. "There's got to be an explanation for this," he said, though his voice wavered. Suddenly the light flared, blindingly bright, and the whispers ceased. For a moment, silence reigned, thick and suffocating. And then they saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the harsh light. The man was pale and gaunt, his hollow eyes fixed on them with an intensity that froze them in place. His clothes were tattered, his skin stretched taut over his bones, and his lips moved soundlessly, as though speaking words no one could hear. His presence was wrong, his form blurred at the edges, like a photograph out of focus. Lena's breath caught in her throat. "Thomas Morrow," she whispered, recognizing him from the faded photographs they had found in the keeper's cottage. The last keeper of the lighthouse, long presumed dead. The figure stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, his skeletal hands reaching out as if in supplication. "Leave, before it takes you too," he rasped, his voice barely more than a hollow echo. As the words left his lips, the light above them flickered violently, and the whispers returned. Louder, angrier, as though the tower itself was screaming in protest. The walls seemed to close in, the air vibrating with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Lena grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her toward the stairs. "Run!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the cacophony. Will and Sam followed, their footsteps pounding against the metal stairs as the tower seemed to shake around them. Behind them, the whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the light flared one last time before plunging them into darkness. They burst through the lighthouse door and into the open air, gasping for breath. But even as they ran, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was watching them from the top of the tower. She glanced back once, and her blood turned to ice. The light was still shining, its unnatural glow piercing through the fog. And in the lantern room, a figure stood motionless, its hollow eyes fixed on her. The whispers had followed them home. Emma's flashlight flickered erratically. "What's that?" she whispered, pointing to something dark on the wall, a message carved into the stone. "Leave, before it sees you." The words chilled Lena's blood. Who would have done this?" she stammered. "I don't know, but it doesn't matter," Sam said, his voice tight. "Let's just get the job done and get out of here." But as they reached the top of the lighthouse, something worse awaited them. The light atop the tower, which had been broken for years, now shone brightly into the fog. It was an unnatural glow, too white, too intense. And as they stood there, trying to figure out what had caused the sudden illumination, they heard it, whispers, low and distant, but unmistakably human. Lena turned, heart racing. "Did you hear that?" Will and Emma looked at her, their faces drained of color. Sam hesitated, then slowly pulled out his phone and began to record. "There's nothing here," he muttered, though his voice quivered slightly. The whispers grew louder, as if someone, or something, was moving closer. The shadows in the room twisted unnaturally, lengthening as if alive. A cold breeze filled the space, even though the windows were sealed tight. Suddenly, the light at the top of the tower flared and then snapped off. Darkness swallowed the room, and then they saw him. A man, pale and gaunt, standing in the doorway of the room behind them. His eyes were empty, hollowed out, and his lips twitched as if trying to speak. But no sound came from his mouth. Lena's blood ran cold. "Thomas Morrow?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. The last keeper of the lighthouse. The figure moved forward, dragging his feet like something broken. As he did, his hands, white and skeletal, reached out, the skin cracked and raw, fingers curling as if in a desperate plea. "Leave! Before it takes you too!" the figure rasped, his voice a hollow echo. Suddenly, the whispers all around them grew deafening, and the light above flickered back on, blinding them. The figure lunged, and the room seemed to bend and warp around them as if the lighthouse itself was alive, feeding off their fear. With a scream, Lena grabbed her family and ran. The door to the lighthouse slammed shut behind them with a thunderous crash, as though the building itself had sealed them in. They didn't stop running until they were back at the cottage, breathless and shaken. But as Lena glanced back at the lighthouse, she saw something that froze her to the core. At the top of the tower, the light was flickering again. But this time, someone was watching them. And the whispers had followed them home.